Good afternoon. I'm Matthew Goldstein, the Chancellor of the City University of New York, and I'd like to welcome all of you to a very interesting hour about a conversation about an extraordinary man, Albert Einstein. Today is March 14th when we are taping this show, and we are celebrating Albert Einstein's 126th birthday. I remember in 1979, I took my two young sons to the Roosevelt Hotel when we were celebrating Einstein's 100th birthday. And my younger son, Seth, always carried a pad and pencil, and he was 5 years old at the time. We walked into the last event of that week at the Roosevelt Hotel, and the final event was a lecture by John Wheeler, a very eminent physicist at Princeton University, at which my young son yelled out, "Is that Einstein? I'm going to go get his autograph." And he went running down the center aisle. Fortunately, John Wheeler had just finished his wonderful lecture. People stood on off their seats in uncontrolled adulation. And my son Seth fell on all fours and started to crawl in between the legs. And I saw someone pulling on John Wheeler's coat. And he looked down and he saw this young fellow and he said, "Who are you?" And he said, "Are you Einstein?" And the guy said, "No." He said, "Well, why?" He said, "Why are you here?" He said, "I want Einstein's autograph." He said, "Well, would you take my autograph instead?" And Seth said, "Well, who are you?" And he said, "My name is John Wheeler." And he said, "Okay, I'll settle for John Wheeler." Today we have the privilege of talking with two very extraordinary men. Both men have had relationships with Albert Einstein in very different ways. Let me first introduce Frederick Seitz. Fred Seitz is an eminent physicist, colleague of Einstein when they were both at Princeton together. He is the former president of the Rockefeller University, a former president of the National Academy of Sciences, and he has served on countless national committees. He's been an advisor to NATO, the President's Science Advisory Committee, the Office of Naval Research, and the Smithsonian Institution, among other national and international agencies. Dr. Seitz has written some of the classic works in physics, including Modern Theory of Solids, and is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Compton Medal, the highest award from the American Institute of Physics, and the National Academy of Engineers Distinguished Honorary Award. Dr. Seitz, it's wonderful to see you, and thank you for joining us.
Well,
In addition, we are privileged to have William Golden with us. When we think about William Golden, we think about one of the earliest men who greatly influenced U.S. science policy and in some sense was the architect of science policy in the United States. He was science advisor to President Truman and influential in the creation of the post of science advisor for president and for presidents that followed. He's played a primary role in establishing the National Science Foundation. He has served in the Atomic Energy Commission, the Department of State, and the Executive Office of the President. Mr. Golden is an honorary life governor of the Board of Governors of the New York Academy of Sciences, Chairman Emeritus of the American Museum of Natural History, and a member of the Board of Trustees of the Graduate Center Foundation. Bill, it's always good to see you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We're here because in 1905, 100 years ago, actually starting with a very significant paper in March of 1905, there was a leap of scientific ingenuity and genius that the world has not seen since that event. In 1905, Albert Einstein, a young clerk of 26 years old, wrote a series of papers, and let me just go through them very briefly because I'm sure many in the audience know his work quite substantially. First, in March, actually St. Patrick's Day, 1905, on March 17th, there appeared a paper called The Light, Quantum, and Photoelectric Effect. For that paper, Albert Einstein was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1921. Second, in April of that year, a new determination of molecular dimensions was completed. This was an outgrowth of Albert Einstein's thesis, where his PhD was conferred. And that paper was cited more than any of the other papers that Albert Einstein wrote. Following that, in May of that year, May 11th in particular, he wrote his monumental paper on Brownian motion, which was really which actually was written before he wrote his PhD thesis, but came out after he wrote his thesis. The fourth paper is the paper that is cited probably by more people and has created greater talk among people who are not scientists, and that is the paper on special relativity, which appeared in June 30th, and that was followed very quickly in September with a very small paper expanding on special relativity with the famous equation E equals mc squared appeared. And finally, and most people don't think about 6 papers that he wrote, but there was a 6th paper, a second paper on Brownian motion, which came out right at the sunset of the year 1905. It was an extraordinary year that obviously turned physics upside down, challenged some of the orthodoxy of the Newtonian view of the world, and the world has not been the same since those original papers. I'd like to start with you, Fred, if we could. This past weekend, I reread Abraham Pais's book called Subtle as the Lord. Subtle as the Lord is a phrase that Einstein used, where he said, subtle is the Lord, but malicious he is not. And there's a wonderful history and a series of stories about that. But in that book, Pai said something very interesting, and I wondered if you could comment on that. He said, and I quote, that Einstein was the freest man I have known. By that I mean, more than anyone else I have encountered, he was the master of his own destiny. If he had a God, it was the God of Spinoza. Einstein was not a revolutionary, as the overthrow of authority was never his prime motivation. He was not a rebel, since any authority, but for one of the reasons seemed too ridiculous for him to waste effort fighting against. He had the freedom to ask scientific questions, the genius to so often ask the right scientific questions. He had no choice but to accept the answer. His deep sense of destiny led him further than anyone before him. It was his faith in himself which made him persevere. Fame may on occasion have flattered him, but it never deflected him. He was fearless of time and to an uncommon degree fearless of death. I cannot find tragedy in this later attitude to the quantum theory or to his lack of success in finding a unified field theory, especially since some of the questions he asked remain a challenge to this day, and since I never read tragedy in his face. An occasional touch of sadness in him never engulfed his sense of humor. Those 2 very small paragraphs, for me, typify much of who this man was. You knew him probably better than anyone in this room. What's your reaction to some of this, Fred?
Well, that's, as in Brown's marvelous command of English, which wasn't his native tongue, it describes him exactly. He had a combination of inner strength and modesty that allowed him to do things that few other people could have done in the same circumstance. He was a modest man, and yet he knew he was great.
You heard of Albert Einstein first when you were a young boy. I think you mentioned to me when you were about 10 years old.
Right.
And Albert Einstein came and gave a series of lectures about 1921, if I recall. What were you were a young boy, but a curious, obviously talented young fellow. What was your reaction
Well,
to...
I was a kid who fell in love with science and read the sort of things that were available. They were limited at that time. They're not now. He came to the United States on a twin mission. One was to raise funds for medical facilities in Jerusalem, which because of the turmoil of World War I was in straits, and also to give the first talks outside of Europe on the two theories of relativity, the special theory and the general theory. They were terribly treated in the newspapers, not the philanthropy. There were many good photographs of him, but the treatment of the science, even a kid of 12 or 11, whatever I was, could tell was junky, if I can use the word. There were people in the United States, particularly in California where I grew up, who could have explained in terms that could have appeared in the home-type newspapers that we had at that time, but they never took the trouble to do so. Should I go on a little?
Sure, that would be great, yeah.
That was straightened out in my own life in my life at Stanford, where I was an undergraduate. I was a major in mathematics and physics, and there was available enough good scientific literature so that not only could I learn as an undergraduate the essentials, but even give talks at the student seminars. All this came to a head when I got an opportunity to become a graduate student at Princeton and continued with the math physics program. I gained entrance through the help of someone I'd met as a summer lecturer at Stanford, Professor Edward Condon, who gained a great deal of notoriety in connection with the great battle he and others waged to make sure that the atomic energy field after the war was placed in civilian hands. Princeton at that time was a very strong center for the field of supergeometry, including, of course, the kind of geometry that Einstein used in his theory of general relativity, a branch of geometry which had been developed by a couple of very brilliant Italian mathematicians with whom Einstein worked in the course of his work on general relativity theory. I had expected to do my thesis with Condon, but he was writing a definitive book on atomic spectra at that time, along with another advanced graduate student. And he turned me over to a newcomer to Princeton, namely Eugene Wigner. I think somewhere there is a picture of him. He was a Hungarian, had been sent to Berlin to study by his father. He wanted to study physics, but his father said, do something practical. You become a chemical engineer. His father ran a leather factory in Budapest and wanted to be sure that his son could follow him in case of need for a job. Well, Eugene was the kind of person who could go through a curriculum in about a third of the time of a normal person. So what he actually did was rush through the curriculum in chemical engineering at the Technical University of Berlin, and then scoot over to the university where he spent his time in the physics department. There, of course, he saw on an everyday basis many of the brilliant people of the time, including Einstein, and I spent much time querying him. What was he like? What did he look like? Although we knew a great deal from the pictures that we'd seen in the newspapers. Eugene had a companion, and he was at Princeton at the time as a professor, sharing a very distinguished professorship with another individual, namely John von Neumann. John had been classified as a mathematical genius by his secondary school teacher and been given very special coaching. He and Eugene had met as students at the secondary school. John would get his coaching lessons, and Gene would trail home with him, explaining what he'd learned and sopping it up at about the rate a man of his almost compatible capability permitted. As I said, knowing that he had spent a lot of time in and around the seminars where Einstein appeared, I would ask him very pointed questions. Again came this, all these qualities which you have emphasized, in addition to the emphasis that he was an exceedingly easy person if you were of the right kind of interest to meet. And that explains many things that occurred later in life. He became a very good friend of Leo Szilard, another one of the Hungarians. He became a very intimate friend of Bram Peiss, which permitted Bram, with the help of the secretary, to collect so much material which appeared in that wonderful book, the definitive biography of Einstein. There was one thing he told me which had never appeared in public and explains a great many things that happened later. In 1928, Einstein had a very serious physical illness. They spent a great deal of time trying to diagnose it. He was hospital-ridden for months, and they greatly feared for his life. 5 years later, when he was in the United States, a top-flight group in New York hospitals did a very careful biopsy. Sorry, I used the wrong term. Analysis of his illness, and found that he had an expanded aorta at the level of his stomach. This interfered with his digestion, and they eventually developed diets which were compatible with his illness. The surgery on the aorta at that time was not possible. This is all described again in Bram's book in some detail, which is why I happen to know now, as I did not, what the nature of his illness was. At that time, Einstein's two main interests in science were, as you have mentioned, to develop a universal theory of all of physics, including gravitation, quantum theory, and the other things in which he was interested. I should add that in the conversations with Wigner, he took great care to explain the many, many areas in which, in the evolution of physics, say between 1905, the period you mentioned, and at the zenith of his career, he was a person who pointed the way that the field should be directed next. The fields of science are run to a considerable degree by oligarchies, each field by a group of people who are the wave pointers. Einstein was responsible for at least 20 of the major steps. For example, he was sent a thesis in the early 20s by a French scientist, actually a prince, which no longer carried any weight in France, suggesting that all of matter should have wave characteristics. Einstein was sent a copy of the thesis. He read it, and he turned it over to a very bright young physicist named Schrödinger and said, "See what you can make of this. I think that buried in it is something very important." Schrödinger not only made it important, but he invented an equation that not only explained some of the things which added to what Schrödinger had done, to what the French scientist had done, but was, as one says, much more general, covered a much broader field. Einstein, surprisingly, took an exception to this. Another physicist named Born had said that Schrödinger's equation does not tell us in classical sense, Newtonian sense, how to determine the way in which systems act. It gives us the probability that they will act in any given way. Einstein was appalled at the suggestion, as he said, God does not throw dice. This became a guiding principle in the periods that followed. He had the two goals. One was to obtain a general picture of all fields of physics under one cover, and the other one was to prove that Schrödinger's theory, wave mechanics, was only one step toward what he regarded as a true theory. When Born's paper on the probabilistic interpretation of Schrödinger's equation appeared, he wrote a scathing denial, which must have caused great anguish for this great man. He meant no harm to the individual. It's just that he had very strong feelings, which he retained.
Fred, could you get back to that in just a second? I want to loop Bill into this at this point, and then come back to some of the areas of science that you've generated. You mentioned Eugene Wigner and Leo Szilard, And this is where Bill Golden sort of comes in to the picture. Szilard requested that Einstein write a letter to Franklin Delano Roosevelt after the controlled fission of Fermi's lap was confirmed, and indicated the potency of this new energy source and how it could result in weapons that were beyond anyone's imagination. And of course the Manhattan Project started as a result of that letter. And after FDR died in office and Truman became the president, you developed a relationship with Truman and ultimately became his science advisor and really helped to shape much of the science around that period of time. It was at that point, I guess, in time that you developed your own relationship with Einstein. And tell us about that relationship and some of the work that you did directly with him, representing the president, and other aspects of your work with the Atomic Energy Commission and so forth.
Well, my relationship with Einstein was very compressed into a part of a single day, but it was I have a distinction of having what you call a relationship, and I suppose it is, but it was a fascinating one. That came about through so many things due to a chain of circumstances, and President Truman was not in them at that time. I was in the Atomic Energy Commission at that time, which was about a year old at the time of my I'd say involvement with Professor Einstein. Einstein had written or communicated to the Secretary of State, George Marshall, that he wanted someone to come to see him, Einstein, to his views on what he deemed to be very important matters. Marshall turned to Louis Strauss, who had been president and chairman of the Institute for Advanced Study, and who was then a member of the Atomic Energy Commission, one of the 5 members. And I was assistant to Louis Strauss, who I'd met in the Navy, where Strauss, a very talented man, originally a banker, had risen to the rank of Rear Admiral in the Navy. My job as assistant to Louis Strauss was a fascinating one, but that's not the subject of what we're talking about. One morning, Strauss came to me in my office, which was immediately adjacent, really connecting with his in the Atomic Energy Commission, and said in his courtly manner, "Bill, would you be willing to take my place in going to see Professor Einstein, who wants to communicate with some important matters that are in his mind?" Well, obviously nothing could have fascinated me more than the sacrifice of a day in Washington to go to Princeton. So I assented to that invitation, and indeed, come on the 6th or 7th of June, 1947, I went to Princeton and was welcomed, I should say, by Professor Einstein and its secretary, Alan Dukas, and spent several hours with him at his home on Mercer Street. What he had to say was, the world is headed for a nuclear war. Well, that attracted my attention, if it needed anything to do that, which it didn't. The Russians will soon, sometime soon, develop an atomic bomb. There's no question of that in my mind, he said. When that happens, when 2 countries have the atomic bomb, there's going to be rivalry between them, and that will lead to war. Each of them will not necessarily want to start a war, but each will be nervous that the other will perhaps start the war, and being the beginner, it would have such important consequences that through nerves or policy or whatever may be, within 2 to 10 years, there will be a nuclear war which will be as destructive of civilization as the popular conception indeed is. The only way to prevent this occurring would be for the creation of a world government. And the world government would have a world military organization. Every country would be welcome to join. If this was formed, the Russians wouldn't attack because the opposition would be so great. This was Einstein talking. And if Russia wanted to join, that would be fine, then there would be a kind of collaborative peace. The World Military Organization would be controlled by the world government. The United States should be the leader in this. In fact, has to be, to cause it to be created, and that's what I want to talk about. He went on to say that the control, the membership, the representatives to the government of the world government would be chosen by popular vote, not by nominations or appointments by the heads of governments. He didn't trust governments, but he would trust the people. He was quite strong about this and referred to it several times. He stressed then that there would be a nuclear war. This was in June, early June 1947. There will be a nuclear war in not less than 10 years from now. So that's where the great Einstein was wrong, that I promised earlier in my remarks. I found a place where he was wrong. However, many things that he said, which seemed to me at the time to be rather unrealistic, was political sense of human and international relations, are more nearly coming into focus now. He went on to say he regretted deeply finding that the American public was becoming increasingly militaristic. And then he gave some analogies about Germany. He said, not like Hitler, but he went on to various other analogies. And in a way, we are becoming increasingly militaristic, and certainly our government seems to be becoming so. He went on to say that there could never be a peaceful world with one country dominating throughout. There would have to be, again, some organization such as the World, not such as, but specifically the World Organization that he was advocating. And if one country tried to dominate, they would surely fail, and there would be great disaster, which he didn't go into detail of what that might be. Well, again, we have something to think about. Maybe he was wrong about the 10-year nuclear war, but maybe his observations of concern have some reason to be concerned at the present time, but that was not evident then. Or that's the essence of the point he wanted to get across, which I communicated to the Secretary of State in a memorandum a few days later. We talked about a few other matters, though. We had tea, and I admired a little statue he had, about 18 inches high, perhaps a wooden statue, quite similar to Mexican santas, which many of us have seen, and one of which I have. This was actually a Madonna, but it was quite charming, and I commented on that. Oh, he said, that's part of my Nobel Prize. So I said, huh? Well, he said he had dinner one time within recent years at the home of a prominent banker, and he admired the little statue, and the next day it was delivered to him at home. And he said, now then I had invested quite a bit of money with this man, and I lost it all. So that was part of my Nobel Prize. Now I've heard it said that the Nobel Prize was promised to his first wife before he got it. I mean, I have no idea.
That shows confidence. That really shows great confidence that he would win the Nobel Prize.
Is it in Bram Pice's book? Or perhaps I don't
Yes,
recall.
it is in Pice's book, yes.
So,
and many other places. Well, let me just look.
One point I might add, it bears on the things you've just said. What did Einstein do during the war? Everyone knows he was a confirmed pacifist, and you've emphasized this point. Well, Benjamin Franklin was much concerned about the group of Quakers in Pennsylvania, and he decided he would class them into two groups, good Quakers and bad Quakers. The bad Quakers would break into prayer when the Indians climbed over the stockade barrier with their tomahawks and knives. The good Quakers would grab a preloaded gun. Einstein was that kind of pacifist. He became an advisor to the Navy. How much advice he gave, but it was in areas of science. And I served on a committee created at Princeton, partly for his benefit, that dealt with certain aspects of ordnance. He didn't do a lot of talking, he would ask questions. Eventually he left that committee to take on fundraising by playing the violin in concerts in New York. After the war, again, as you've emphasized, he immediately returned to the complete pacifistic frontier.
Fred, could we just loop back to some of your earlier comments? You came to Princeton in, I guess, the early 30s?
32.
32, and Einstein arrived at the Institute
in
34.
Was very prominent. He immediately shed all the formality that was expected of a professor, and in dress and other things, he was to be seen everywhere.
He was gregarious.
Gregarious.
He was very social. He loved jokes. He had lots of interests other than science. He loved to sail. He loved Mozart. He loved Beethoven. He loved to play his violin with a companion on the piano.
I have an anecdote there I think will interest you.
Go ahead, please.
My wife had a brother who worked for the Bell Labs and lived in Princeton. And he formed a group of Cub Scouts. When I was visiting after having obtained my degree and left, we made arrangements that my wife would lead the Scouts to the physics department, and then I would take the Scouts through it. As we approached the front door of the physics department, it swung open, and who should walk out but Albert Einstein? And here was this row of Cub Scouts. He went along and patted each one on the head. You can imagine that's something they remember the rest of their lives.
Ask you a question. You mentioned Einstein, starting in the mid-30s, was becoming more and more isolated scientifically. He did not accept quantum mechanics for the reasons that you had said. He really believed very strongly in much more deterministic causality, and the probabilistic nature of quantum mechanics really just never stayed with him. Yet he accepted it as a provisional approach, hoping that a unified theory someplace later on would incorporate it. But one of the things that has always been a mystery to me, and I think to others in the scientific establishment, of why he didn't take the approach of the oligarchs to the extent of creating a coterie of people to carry on his work. He never had a PhD student, I understand, that he supported or worked with. He was not terribly interested in teaching. His science was much more isolated from the mainstream of what was going on at the time, of the great movements after quantum mechanics were discovered. Is that in some way a reason for his movement much more towards political matters, that he really started to have a much more balanced kind of life, which was totally imbalanced before? Why didn't he why didn't he try to develop more people to support his ideas instead of working in such isolation? He had all this great talent at Princeton. I'm sure graduate students would love to have worked with him.
Well, let me give you my view. Both von Neumann and Wigner, who were at Princeton at this time, were people he knew well from his Berlin days. And periodically, he would call them together and explain the status of his research. Their reaction was, I was present by chance because I was Wigner's student at a number of these meetings. Their attitude toward him at that stage, say 1933-34, was as follows. They revered him. They treated him with the deepest respect. They encouraged him to continue his work. But one could tell from their attitude toward it that they didn't believe it. They no longer felt that he was in the mainstream, as they were. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They were busy working on the wave theory and realized that it was probably the terminal direction at that level.
That would explain a good part of it.
And I would lay much of it due to as a result of the illness that I described earlier, that made a permanent change in his physiology.
So, if we were to summarize some of the personal reactions that you or Bill you had, of course yours was a much more restricted opportunity to see him rather than you, Fred. You had a much more sustainable impact. What would you say, if you were to summarize very quickly, was the major impact of his work in science? I mean, how has science changed our view of the world today from a Newtonian kind of world to a world that we see through very different lenses as a result of Albert Einstein's science?
Well, it's a paradox. As I said earlier, he led the way again and again and again, and then he turned aside. And I would ascribe it to the illness. Something froze. He believed in classical causality.
Yes.
And that was it.
Bill, if you were last word on the impact that Albert Einstein had as now a celebrity. I mean, he was really the first celebrity scientist that we had in the 20th century. Yeah. I mean, people didn't talk about scientists with the great reverence and honor that was bestowed upon Albert Einstein. Yeah. But he had a soul that communicated quite effectively. You mentioned his pacifism. He was asked to be the president of Israel by Abba Eban, who was a representative of the government at that time. How has his humanity and his lens on peace in the world, how is that affected today by any of his work or his words or his writings that you would see?
Well, I think he either actively or passively, intentionally or subconsciously had a real sense of theater, I think. I often wonder about his untidy appearance, whether that was affected or whether he just didn't know any better than to look untidy, which he certainly
saved money on socks. He never wore socks, right?
That's right. So the several hours I had with him, I was impressed, among other things, with his warmth and with the depth of his feeling on what might be called pacifistic lines, or I would say really on human kindness. Rahmanas is the word.
He was a very kind man,
Yeah.
and a very genuine man.
So I
And,
don't know. He was strongly opposed to developing the United States, to trying to develop and succeeding in developing the so-called hydrogen or
Yeah,
super
right, the
bomb,
super bomb.
as were many other scientists of distinction.
One of the special relationships that he had was with Leo Szilard. Do you remember Leo, who was, again, a third Hungarian, always claimed that the group, and there were about a dozen of them, were Martians. And he and Einstein joined in producing a number of patents. Leo had the capability of bringing up some idea that he thought was patentable with Einstein. His old experience in the Swiss patent office would come to the surface, and there would be a patent. I don't think they ever got rich on that.
He was also a wonderful jokester.
Oh,
he
yes.
loved jokes and would roar with great laughter. That part of his humanity was so infectious, and I think that's why people were so drawn to him. Towards the end of his life, he died in 1955, 56, of an aneurysm on his aorta. And I believe, if I recall, reading this a long time ago, that originally it was thought that he had some ulcer that caused these digestive problems, but it was really the beginning of an aneurysm that ultimately
Yeah, and that was
took his
detected
life.
in New York, but it was inoperable.
He also had, talking a little about, as we complete this fascinating hour together, he also had a tragic personal life. It's so interesting. He stood at the apex of the world scientifically. He had a great sense of people. He loved people around him. He loved to take walks with close associates. His relationship with Kurt Gödel has been written about, and I understand a new book on that relationship has occurred. But at the same time, he also had an awful lot of personal pain. Estranged from his sons for some time, a daughter who disappeared, a marriage that broke up. Were you aware of those inner turmoils in the relationship that you had with him? Was that ever evident? Did he wear it on his sleeve?
Not on my level. I'm sure people closer to his generation were aware of all that.
Any last words before we complete this fascinating time together? Bill, anything?
Well, I don't think so. I just comment that the fact that he was regarded by the scientific world as a great scientist was dealing in matters that were not understandable to the general public or even to many levels of scientists, perhaps gave a certain dramatic appeal to him. Another such a person, not quite to the same degree, was Robert Oppenheimer, who, after the creation of the atomic bomb, was a very popular figure. And he had a real sense of drama, the way he dressed, the way he appeared in many ways. He was very talented also. So perhaps being, what shall I say, not understandable helps in creating a certain respect in the public eye. I leave that as the question for all of you.
Fred, any last thoughts?
One last thing I might mention. In the middle of the war, I had an opportunity to expand facilities that were all involved in war research. That was taken for granted. 14-hour days, 7 days a week, and so forth. And I found myself appointed head of the physics department at the Carnegie Institute of Technology, in which was embedded a wonderful, wonderful man, Otto Stern. Otto was a refugee, had been head of the Institute of Physics at University of Hamburg. We became fast friends. And that friendship originated as a result of a series of discussions with him. He got his doctorate degree in 1910 and selected a postdoc. He actually came from a well-to-do family, so the money was not involved, but the appointment was, with Einstein when he was at Prague. I had a picture of Einstein at the time of Prague, which I don't know whether it can be visible here, but it appeared on the front page of the magazine Science, 2 or 3 issues back. And it shows Einstein in what I believe is the most intense period of his life. He achieved brilliant success, was made many offers, but he was out for new game, namely the general theory of relativity, and was focused, and that intensity appears in this beautiful photograph. I don't know whether it can be projected.
We have that in the next segment.
It will be in the...
Yes. You know, in my last word, I have always been a great admirer of his work, and certainly the mathematics surrounding general relativity. But I've always been so amazed of how he was able to have these leaps of extraordinary insight, working in an isolated way in such a concentrated amount of time that was so collapsed, and have those ideas that were done in isolation and were done from pure thought experiments. There was no experimentation at all that was driving a lot of what he did, and how his work has really changed the way in which we look at the world today. There are very few people who we have experienced in our lives and history that can claim that kind of mantle for success. Thank you, Fred Seitz. Thank you, Bill Golden. This was a fascinating hour, and thank you for all being with us today. Thank you from the Graduate School and University of St.